Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 news. It's race weekend for the Canadian Grand Prix and Mercedes have revealed just where their next step in performance is going to come from with this current car concept. Some of it could come this year, most of it might well come next year in terms of an entirely new rear suspension design that they believe will give them a lot of extra performance and potentially attempts to leapfrog Red Bull. Very much intrigued to hear your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. Just a quick comment here because I know some of you mentioned this yesterday that of the 4 drivers that were at Alfa Romeo Sauber over that period, Charles Leclerc is the only one to have not achieved anything. Okay, look, he won in Monza for Ferrari, but look, there's a F1 World Champion here, there's a Le Mans winner here, there's an Indy 500 winner here, so and there's also a top 10 Spotify hit in Uruguay champion here as well, unfortunately, but he did say that he would love to compete in the 24-hour Le Mans at some point. It's an incredible event. For sure, one day in my life, I want to tick that box. When it will be, I don't know. Extremely proud of what Ferrari has done at winning them on, of course, if you guys didn't see that story yesterday, and he can only hope that they can try and transfer some of that success to their Formula 1 team, but it doesn't look super likely. Quick update as well on the current international standings of the World Cup, I suppose. So after Spain, Nick de Vries is carrying Max Verstappen on his back, 170 points for the Netherlands. Second place is Great Britain with, of course, Hamilton, Russell and Norris at 164. Far more interesting this championship, I think, than the actual main championship, so I'll keep updated on this as and when it happens. Spain, though, at 157, of course, with Alonso and Sainz. Mexico is Checo Perez, and then you get down to Monaco, and further down than that, USA, unfortunately, with Logan Sargent, nil points so far. But yeah, how is this going to end up this season, right? Because you'd surely think that Norris, Hamilton and Russell, Norris's car is bad, but Hamilton and Russell solo, or like as a duo, should be able to outscore Verstappen, you would think, from now to the end of the year, and or Nick de Vries, so outscore Nick de Vries, right? And then Spain, right, between Alonso and Sainz, you'd also think that they have a good chance. So I think it's interesting. It could go either of the 3 ways here, depending on how Ferrari and Aston Martin do, and Max Verstappen could win it on his own, right? So who knows? Germany are down here in 8th with 6 points, and that is Nico Hülkenberg's doing, and the rumours are circulating today that he has a very strong chance, if he maintains this level, of maintaining his seat at Haas for next year. So far, he's been the more promising in qualifying and the race in general compared to Magnussen, who did a pretty good job there last year, so does raise questions about Mick Schumacher in that case, but still, he has strong chances of staying. The rumour has it that if he maintains his current form, he's going to earn a contract extension going to next year, which is certainly justified, but last year's Haas started out quite well and then dramatically fell off as upgrades happened and were necessary for other teams, and if that happens again this year, then in the same way that Mick Schumacher, when he actually had some good performances, it didn't seem as good because the car was terrible. It might be a similar story for Hülkenberg, we'll see about that. There's also been some big debate over the last few days on what exactly makes an F1 driver an all-time great. Jenson Button actually says that out of the 3 drivers on in the picture here, Hamilton and Verstappen need to do other racing series, i.e. a Le Mans, World Endurance Championship, Indy 500 maybe, something else to cement themselves as a great driver. His idea is, and I think it's a justifiable one, that to be the greatest driver ever, you can't just have done Formula 1, you need to have other things in your arsenal. Now, will Hamilton actually compete in any other sport? I'm not so sure. Does he care what Button thinks? I imagine he doesn't either. But Alonso has done other things. He's won Le Mans a couple of times. He tried to win the Indy 500, right, to complete the Triple Crown. That hasn't happened. Maybe it'll happen in the future. Alonso might go back and try that a few more times. Who knows? So maybe that's an argument there, right? And that's what Button's been putting forward. There's also been the debate going around as to whether Verstappen needs to go to another team at some point to cement his legacy as one of the absolute all-time greats. Because Hamilton, Schumacher and Senna, like let's just look at those 3. They all at some point joined a team and took them to the top. Joined a struggling team, took them up. Obviously, Schumacher at Ferrari is the classic example where they were struggling. Schumacher comes in with Ross Brawn and others and they make it a championship dynasty team. Senna at Lotus is a good example. Even Hamilton in like 2009 at McLaren, taking them back to being competitive after they struggle with those regulation changes. And then Mercedes is the obvious example, taking that risk, joining that team, and then helping them become what they became over the several years. Whereas Verstappen didn't really do that, right? He joined Red Bull, the car got good, and now he's winning everything and might continue to win everything. Will people look back on his career in the same way as they look back on Hamilton, Schumacher's and Senna's if he doesn't go to another team and try and build them up? And Richard Bradley here, winner of LMP2 category at Le Mans, he said that Verstappen will will possibly in a few years' time go to Ferrari and try and do what Schumacher did for them, like in the modern era, which is an interesting debate. I don't know if Verstappen really cares about that, but in terms of legacy, compared to these other greats of the sport, there might be part of Verstappen that thinks, you know what, once I've won like 5 titles at Red Bull, I might consider something else, as Vettel did, let's be honest, right, when he went to Ferrari and, you know, he got kind of close, but it didn't work out in the end. Will Verstappen win everything, though, for the next several years? That is the question that Mercedes are going to try and put an end to. This season, it's not going to happen, but going forwards, that is their main intention, and the rumours are circulating, and Mercedes admitted themselves that it's their rear suspension and just suspension improvements in general where they are targeting upgrades. And this is, I think, what people have discovered about the Red Bull. Like, the Red Bull floor is obviously very good. The way the airflow works, it's fantastic. But I think it might well be the suspension where a lot of the magic of that Red Bull is. We know about the anti-dive, the anti-squat mechanics of the suspension that give them so much advantage. Carries its downsides, but it's more upside than downside for that Red Bull concept, and they've absolutely nailed it. Mercedes completely redesigned their front suspension for this brand new upgrade package, but it's further changes they would like to make going forwards, and they believe this is where the richest seam of development lies in terms of how they can continue to develop their car. So they entirely redesigned the front suspension of the W14 Evo, as some people are calling it, to give more stability on the car. It's probably given us more freedom, because the issue that we always had prior to that was getting good front end when you needed it at the apex and good entry stability when you're hard on the brakes and turning in. The compromise was always something that we could not resolve. You're either left with a weak rear end on entry or a poor front at the apex. So hopefully that's moved us in the right direction, right? So either the car is going to be understeery, a poor front at the apex, or oversteery, a weak rear on the entry, and finding the compromise there wasn't really working for them. They've redesigned the front suspension. That has most certainly helped. But going forward, it's the rear suspension they want to look at. But as he says, we've done a new suspension this year. Suspensions are expensive things to bring to the car. So the reality is that with the cost cap in place, we're always looking at the championship situation. And this is the question for fans of Formula 1 out there that might be watching that want a competitive season. Would you rather have Red Bull win 22 races this season? They absolutely dominate everything. Verstappen wins like 15 in a row or something and walks to a new record-breaking championship points tally or something. But then next year, Mercedes and maybe Ferrari and maybe Aston are right up there, and the season from the start is incredibly competitive. Or would you rather Mercedes really push hard on this year's car, get to the point where at the end of the year they can take a few races off Verstappen, but then next year Red Bull have the fastest car again anyway? And this is the debate that Hamilton has brought up to Mercedes. Like, look, we've got to make sure that next year's car we get it right. It doesn't really matter what happens this year to a certain degree. It's about making sure that next year they start out on a level playing field as much as they possibly can. And in part, the cost cap forces them to do that. They can't afford to just bring new suspension after new suspension this year, because they'll run out of money eventually for this year's car, and it will also affect their development of next year's car. Fundamentally, you can't actually change the rear suspension that much this year anyway, because you bring the gearbox, they design the gearbox themselves, that's homologated, and you can't change that much. So an entirely new rear suspension design in season, even if they had unlimited money, isn't really feasible anyway. So that's what Chauvelin says, that in season he wouldn't expect to be making massive strides, but going forwards, that's where the rich seam of development here that we can start to look at is coming from. So those programs are working, implying that they're already looking at next year's car, obviously, and how they would redesign especially their rear suspension to optimize it and combine everything together. So that is the key development direction they are looking at, is especially the rear suspension of the W15, I suppose it will be. They can maybe bring a few ideas to the W14, but it's next year's car they're really looking at. But I thought it was quite interesting they say specifically that there's a rich seam of development to be unlocked there, because I think the hope is for Formula 1 fans that want a competitive season, the Red Bull are near enough at the limit of what their car concept is capable of, and a lot of that is potentially being unlocked via suspension tricks that teams are now starting to discover. Mercedes have probably tried a few things in the simulator and realised, yeah, actually, hang on, this is where a lot of those, well, benefits to lap time are to be discovered, and they can only do so much of that this season, though a lot of it's going to go to next year. But it's interesting to know that they understand where they can bring massive amounts of performance to the car. It's a lag time in making that happen, but at least they are confident that they can close the gap to Red Bull in the course of the next several months. And as I say, due to the homologation of the gearbox, changing the rear suspension isn't even really that feasible mid-season, so we'll see how it goes. The other piece as well, just to quickly mention here, is because these upgrades have addressed some of Hamilton's frustrations with not not really feeling the rear of the car. It does seem like the car's in a better spot now. Hamilton is happier, but nonetheless, due to their original chassis design that accommodated the zero pods, they have Hamilton very far forward in the car, and Russell, of course, as well, compared to especially the Red Bull. This is something that apparently won't be able to get fixed mid-season. The upgrades aren't going to solve these issues, but they might find some ways to work around it. So there's a few compromises, and this is the thing. The Mercedes is quite quick this year now, certainly it was in Spain, but there's several compromises on the car with the cockpit positioning, with the coordination between the front and the rear suspensions, which isn't where they would like it to be, that are holding them back. So they might win a race as they did last year in Brazil. They might win a couple, possibly, but any more than that is going to be a challenge for Mercedes, I think, given how compromised their current setup is, and the cost cap is partly at fault for that. But that is just the way that Formula 1 is nowadays, and it does mean that across the grid, we do have a very competitive season outside of the front, where fundamentally it really matters. So maybe Mercedes can stop Red Bull dominating until 2026. Just a quick rumour on that as well, because people have been saying that indeed we will be having a quite significant weight reduction to the cars, and that is what F1 is pushing for. I think it's been quite clearly realised that this 800 kilogram-ish F1 car is just too heavy for most circumstances, especially at the start of a race when it's 900 kilos with 100 kg of fuel on board. Back in 2008, the cars were under 600 kg. So, and you know, in the refueling days, they didn't have to have full tanks all the time. So they were so nimble, so much fun to watch. Nowadays, it's not quite the same deal. So they're going to try and reduce the weight. I don't know what's achievable here. I think some people have said they might be pushing for like maybe 750 kg, maybe 730 kg, trying to lose at least maybe 30, 40 kilos of additional weight on the car, which would be good to see, a good step forward. Probably not as much as we'd like, but it is what it is. So very much intrigued to hear your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care, and I'll see you next time.